So to better understand what actual disruption looks like and how it takes place, let's look at a prominent example in the steel industry, an industry that I know pretty well, as I've helped companies such as Glockner Metals define their strategy and develop ways to disrupt their own industry. And I'll do this by examining the developments within this steel industry from the years 1965 to about the 1990s. And we'll also look at a chart so you really understand the process of low-end disruption, but more on that later. So historically, high-quality steel production was regarded as the domain of incumbents, the integrated steel plants, and were unrivaled in terms of quality but also production capacity. And their large market share and high added value guaranteed profits for a very long time. But in the middle of the 1960s, mini mill steelmaking started to become commercially viable. So mini mills, pioneered by a company named Nucor, employed widely available technology and equipment using electric arc furnaces to melt scrap steel as opposed to blast furnaces which melt iron and other products into end products like bars, rods, steel, sheet metal, etc. And even though integrated steel mills and mini mills looked very similar, scale was essentially the only differentiating factor. So it cost approximately $8 billion to build a competitive integrated steel mill, requiring the output to be much greater than that of mini mills. So in contrast, mini mills could be built for much less and can produce steel at a fraction of the cost, a tenth to be exact, making mini mills a highly disruptive technology. So one would think that every integrated steel company would have adopted this low-cost mini mill technology, and especially in the steel industry where steel is considered a commodity. Yet not a single integrated steel company had invested into the mini mills, even after the technology occupied nearly half of North American steel production in the 2000s, I believe. Think of that. How does disruption actually find its next lunch? Well, disruptive innovation usually starts off with a low-quality product. Example would be rebar. So rebar usually is used in construction and cemented within a building or construction site, and it's generally a very low volume and or low margin product or segment of a much larger and mature market. So the customers of this lower segment demand products that mainstream customers, for instance, sheet metal customers, do not or are not willing to give up performance for. So, or simply put, disruptive innovation is not good enough for mainstream customers. More so, the mainstream customers straight out reject disruptive innovation, holding the incumbent essentially hostage of its own success. And this is a key point to keep in mind. And because mini mill technology was inferior at the beginning, it could not really provide all the higher quality steel products as the integrated steel mills could. And in this stage, new technologies can either be inefficient or seem expensive due to the fact that the technologies have not yet scaled enough, or seem cheaper because they simply do much less. And the reactions from incumbents also follow a very predictable pattern, and we'll take a look at a chart. Okay, so to better understand low-end disruption, let's take a look at a textbook example of this. So in the chart, you can see the x-axis, which is time, and the y-axis is performance. That could be anything from quality to hard drive capacity, depending on what your product is and what industry you're looking at. So disruptive technology always starts from the bottom left and goes to the top right. So it moves from the low end to the high end markets. So these colorful lines here, low, medium, high, and most demanding usage, are basically customer segments or customer types. These could also represent whole industries. And as you can see, the disruptive technology improves over time and moves up market. So now let's take a look at the real world example I mentioned, which is Nucor, or the mini mill example. So x-axis again are the years, and the y-axis is the steel quality. And what this chart shows is the steel quality over time for the mini mills. So the bright red line is the improvement over time, and as you can see, the mini mills started here in the rebar market, so very low quality. Market share in terms of tons was 4%, gross margin 7%, so not really anything to write home about. And then moved and improved their quality and moved up market with angle, iron, bars, rods, structural steels, which had a gross margin of 18% and had a market share of 22%. up until the point where they moved all the way to sheet steel, which was the last market for the integrated steel mills to move to, and had a market share over 50% in terms of tons. And that shows you why it's so dangerous, because there's no place more to go here after sheet metal. So generally, the incumbents are motivated to flee up market, as you can see here, and disruptive technology moves up and eats away these markets as they improve quality. So, and the last thing I would like to highlight is you can see a textbook example, which is almost mirrored in the real world as well. But this is how low-end disruption takes place and why it's so dangerous for incumbents to ignore, because it's easy to say, okay, the rebar, 7% gross margin, let's just disregard that, because again, they're motivated to flee and improve their overall balance sheet by going up into higher profit or gross margin markets like here, 12, 18, or 20 to 30% in terms of sheet metal. The incumbents are forced to ignore the new technology, as it is often a market segment of low interest, low volume, low margin, and does not really meet the growth requirements dictated by a much larger corporation and company size. And as such, the integrated steel mills exited the rebar market. Remember, it only accounted for about 4% of the total market in terms of tons, and they basically left it for the mini mills to feast on. And as time went on, the mini mills occupied the rebar segment and started growing rapidly, solving their initial quality problems while retaining their cost advantage. And this is normally where the disruptor goes through a rapid learning curve, solving quality and performance issue, and suddenly starts threatening the incumbent in its main markets. And these would be like angle, bars, and rods. The integrated steel mills always scramble to put together a response, but almost always this fails, as so in this case, because the disruptor has a head start and culture that is much more adaptable or agile, if you want, and retreats essentially to a higher market. And in this case, it would be structural steel. And ultimately what happens, the market begins to demand the replacement of the incumbent's technology with the new technology. And at this point, the whole market begins to see the potential of these capabilities and the new technology, forcing the incumbents to go further up market. And this would be sheet metal, into a dead end with no market left to go up to. And it's really important to reiterate, disruption has little to do with technology or digital business models per se. That's why companies shouldn't focus on the digital part of the digital transformation movement, as they tend to in Germany, but unfortunately this point is lost on most companies. So what are the key takeaways? What do we learn from this so far? Well, for one, because companies do not fully embrace the powerful principles and concept of the innovator's dilemma, incumbents unfortunately get disrupted in a very predictable fashion simply for doing everything right. And ironically, the companies respond also in a very rational manner. Customers essentially hold the companies hostage for being successful, demanding further improvements to their products and services, for which they are willing to pay higher prices. Mainstream customers, on the other hand, tend to reject disruptive technology. And as the company retreats into more lucrative markets and leads the incumbent into a dead end with no escape. So it moves up market, and at some point you can't go any higher. You just fall off the brackets.